Okay. Thank you for tuning in to Facebook Live to hear my family story. My name is Ralph Samuel, and I am a Holocaust survivor. I was born in Shanghai, China, and I'll now describe what brought my parents there. My parents were born in small towns in Germany near the Baltic Sea. Next slide, please. In the early 1900s. Actually, my father was born in 1900. My father was from Baumgarten and my mother was from Strelitz. They attended public schools where their friends were not Jewish. But at this time, religion did not appear to have been an issue. Regardless, my father's parents were insistent on not displaying any Jewish identity in their home. Even when walking to their synagogue, my grandfather wrapped his prayer book in a shawl and shawl in a newspaper to be less conspicuous. My father's family had owned a granary that sold seed to the farmers in the spring and purchased and distributed the harvested crop in the fall. This business had been in existence for many years through the 1800s, going through several generations of the Samuel family into the early 1900s. At one point, my grandfather had received a commendation from the Duke that ruled over this region of Germany for his service and support. My mother's father, Adolf Zimak, fought in the German army in World War I and suffered a significant injury and then subsequently came home and died a couple years later from his wounds. For many years, the family had owned a dry goods store that sold fabric and related supplies. Next slide. You see the store there on the main street. Adolf Seemark is the photo on the right, and on the left, that's a postcard actually taken in the year 1900 of that street. The store is on the left, about halfway down. However, my grandmother had to close this store in the early 1930s due to increasing Nazi harassment. My mother then took an office job at a local business. In 1934, my mother was encouraged to move to nearby Rostock, a larger town, where she got an office job. Here she met her future husband and they soon started dating. However, due to the difficult conditions then in Germany, they didn't get married until 4 years later in August 1938. After their wedding, they lived in Rostock. During the early 1930s, my father's farm products business declined as the Nazis created laws that canceled debts owed to Jews. So when the farmers' debts were canceled, my father lost what had remained of the family grain business. The new restrictive laws were succeeding in driving Jews out of business and continually making their lives more difficult. The office where my mother worked in Rostock was on the second floor of a building fronting to the street. She had worked there only a short time when the owner felt that he could no longer resist the pressure from the Nazis against the hiring of Jews. He told my mother that he had to let her go. She phoned my father, who promptly came to pick her up. And when he arrived at the office, he had walked up to the second floor to let her know that he was there. She asked him to briefly wait downstairs on the sidewalk. As my father started down the stairs, he passed a couple of Nazi SS officers coming up the stairs. He reached the sidewalk in front of the building and started strolling, waiting for my mother. Suddenly, as he walked along the building, a large office machine came crashing to the sidewalk close behind him. He quickly moved away from the building and then joined my mother. And as they left the building, and as they left the office, when the officers had arrived, my parents had avoided a disaster. I should note here that my father was tall, blond, and blue-eyed, and simply did not look Jewish by Hitler standards. Being less obvious made it uh, uh, made it less threatening for my parents to move around because my father absolutely did not look Jewish. Only 3 months after my parents' wedding, they lived through Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, November 9th, 1938. At this point, they realized that they had to prepare to leave Germany. Jewish men were now being arrested and taken to detention centers. To avoid detection, my parents left Rostock, moving to several towns before traveling by train to Berlin. Shortly after they arrived in Berlin, they learned from their mothers when they called home that Nazi officers had searched their home in Rostock looking for my father. The officers had interrogated my grandmothers for information about them. However, my parents had never told their mothers where they would be, so that their mothers were perfectly honest in telling the officers they had no knowledge of where they were. In Berlin, they would frequently move to different Jewish homes to avoid detection. At each stop, the family would give them names of other families to contact for future nights. So, in some cases, the men of these homes had already been arrested by the Gestapo. On one occasion after Kristallnacht, they were taking a cab to another part of Berlin. The cab driver, a proud Nazi, offered to give them a tour of the destroyed synagogues, shops, and Jewish homes. My parents thanked the driver and told him they had no time for sightseeing and requested to take a direct route. On another occasion in Berlin, my parents had needed to briefly separate while running errands. They had then planned to meet later at a particular intersection. My father got there first and waited for my mother. While waiting, a Nazi SS officer approached my father and struck up a conversation. Both of them were chuckling at a remark when my mother returned. She was horrified at the sight of seeing my father standing there with the officer and hesitated to approach them. When my father saw her, he wished the officer farewell and joined my mother. The scene would not have been possible if my father had looked Jewish. They now explored all possible avenues to leave Germany. They considered many countries, but none would take immigrants. By sheer coincidence, had met friends on the street who told them that they possessed 4 tickets on an ocean liner traveling to Shanghai, China. Unfortunately, the couple could use only 2 of their tickets because the other 2 tickets were for their parents who were too old and infirm to travel anymore. My parents immediately purchased their 2 extra tickets. Then they proceeded to make travel arrangements, including travel permits, and train tickets to the Italian port of Genoa. Next slide, please. Their ship, the Italian liner Victoria, was scheduled to depart Shanghai on February 23rd, 1939. To depart for Shanghai on February 23rd. By this time, they were allowed to take only $4 per person plus possessions. And you'll note on these passports the nice big red J, so everyone should know they're Jewish, and the swastika on each below the eagle. And of course, in my mother's case, she has a middle name, Sarah. Well, my mother is curious because my mother never had a middle name. She was simply born Hilda Samuel. But the Nazis required that women have a middle name of Sarah to make it more obvious. Okay, anyway, by this time, when they were preparing, they were only allowed to take $4 plus their possessions. Since they had ample funds, they purchased large steamer trunks and loaded them with everything they thought they could possibly need in their new life in a strange country. They bought clothing, bedding, cookware, and other items. However, they were forbidden to take any valuables such as diamond rings or cash. Anybody caught attempting to take such items out of the country would have been immediately arrested. They traveled by train south through northern Italy. The next slide, please. To the port of Genoa. And there you see the line from Berlin leading to Genoa. And for their security, they rode in separate compartments on the train while traveling through Germany. Passengers were not allowed to take photos out the window. And while traveling through Germany, passengers were not allowed to take photos out the window. Photography was only allowed after the train had crossed the border into Italy. German SS officers regularly moved about the train, monitoring passengers. Their ship traveled south from Genoa along the west coast of Italy, through the Mediterranean Sea, Suez Canal, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and many ports, where the ship would stop for several days to transfer cargo. You must realize that this was a steamer that handled cargo and passengers, so the cargo was just as important, and they took ample time at each port to transfer cargo. While this ship started in the winter weather of northern Italy, the ship traveled to ports that were close to the equator and very hot. After several weeks at sea, and next please, next slide. After several weeks at sea, their ship arrived in the port of Shanghai. And I should just point out, this slide just shows my parents at one of the ports, and the ship, the steamship, and one of the ports using oxen to load, to handle, what do you call it? Well, to handle merchandise. The humid climate, so after several weeks at sea, their ship arrived in the port of Shanghai. Now my parents and other refugees were in for a shock. The humid climate, the culture, and the primitive conditions presented a formidable challenge. This was a totally different environment from what they had known in Germany. Shanghai was one of the few places in the world that accepted Jews at this time. Many Jews had fled here earlier in the 1900s from Eastern Europe and had become part of the Shanghai community. In addition, there were also many Middle Eastern Jews that had settled in Shanghai. It had been a bustling port city for many years and had many foreign residents. The refugees were met at the ship by members of HIAS, who had arranged for them to be picked up in open trucks and driven to a reception center known as the Heim. So if you can imagine, these people were well dressed on the ship, and now we're standing on open trucks, driving through from the port to the collection center. Here they were given at the Heim, which is really a German word for a large home. Here they were given information about living opportunities, food, and other necessities. To provide temporary shelter, large dormitory rooms had been furnished with bunk beds. Men and women slept in separate dorms. These close quarters caused tension that often resulted in disputes. Each day, the central kitchen served hot meals in a dining hall that provided basic nourishment. This Heim was only meant to provide temporary shelter and guidance to the refugees to find housing elsewhere in Shanghai. Since they had very little money, my parents were encouraged to find a room in the Honky district, which was the low-rent district of Shanghai. So after 2 weeks of seemingly endless searching, they found that each day they would move around this part of Shanghai looking for a room. Here they found a one-room apartment in the Honky district. Here the living conditions were very primitive. Cooking was done on a small grill. Toilets consisted of a small barrel-like pot known as the honey pot that was emptied daily by a Chinese worker. Screenless windows provided no protection against insects, but this was better for them. They felt this was far better than living in the dormitory where they were crammed together very tight quarters with the others. So next slide, please. Once my parents got settled, well, first thing when they got an address, then they registered for a local. There was a local directory of refugees, and so they registered that these are their. You notice that the Chinese printing and the blue actually, I believe, is Japanese printing. So so now they had an apartment, and they were on their own and had to figure out how to make a living. Initially, they sold some of their possessions. After pursuing several ideas, they realized there was a sausage factory processing plant in Shanghai. Since there were many Europeans living in the well-to-do parts of Shanghai, my parents decided to try to sell them sausages. This was a lark that they thought might be interesting. So my father purchased a backpack and then bought several sausages from the processor. He went by streetcar to one of the European districts and there went from house to house. To his surprise, he quickly sold all the sausages that he had brought that first day. Through customer referrals, he then developed a route of customers. This business lasted a few weeks, a couple months, until the Japanese military took control of Shanghai and restricted the movement of the stateless Jewish refugees. They created the Ghetto in early 1943. This fenceless area in the Hongkou district was about 1 square mile of narrow lanes with very primitive housing. It was defined only by the 4 streets that served as the boundaries. The announcement was made by the Japanese military, posting signs throughout the region on lampposts that in Shanghai, stating that the Jewish refugees had to move into this designated area within 1 week. Residents of the ghetto would then have to request a permit to leave during the day and had to return to the ghetto in the evening. These passes were issued by Goya, the head of the Japanese military detail, who gave himself the title King of the Jews. He was very short and would sometimes stand on his desk to be taller than the refugees when they passed by his desk. For the next 2.5 years, until the end of the war in fall 1945, the 18,000 refugees were confined to living in this ghetto. At one point, a high-ranking SS officer arrived from Japan to meet with the Japanese officers here at the ghetto. It was learned that the purpose of his visit was to discuss plans for the Japanese to develop gas chambers to kill the 18,000 Jewish refugees in the ghetto. However, the Japanese refused to consider any such plan and agreed only to maintain the Jews in the ghetto. Due to the humid climate and bad conditions, many refugees contracted tropical diseases like malaria and scarlet fever, and many succumbed to these. They had not encountered such diseases in Europe. Consequently, many refugees, including my mother, became very ill, and as I said, some died from these diseases. I was born in October 1941. 2 years before the ghetto, in the Mount Moriah maternity ward, which was staffed by refugee doctors and nurses. To get there, my parents had traveled by rickshaw, drawn by a coolie, running barefoot through the streets. And my sister Ruth was born subsequently, was actually born in the ghetto 2.5 years later in 1944. Cooking while living in either apartment for that matter. They had a 1-room apartment, so cooking was done on the balcony on a small charcoal grill that was only large enough to accommodate 1 pot. Since a meal often required heating more than 1 pot, they would leave the first pot on the grill until the contents were boiling. Then the boiling pot was removed from the grill and quickly wrapped in blankets and placed in their bed. So you've got now a boiling pot in the bed that, with the blanket wrapped around it, would continue boiling for a short while. In the meantime, a second pot could be heated on the grill. And this way they could cook a meal at least with two pots. Next photo, please. Um, these are, I'm sorry, I missed the slide here. These are pictures of yours truly at different stages in Shanghai. Next, please. And there's the pot. A staple food, my pot and silverware and stuff, all this stuff came from Germany. A staple food, of course, was rice, but this presented one challenge. The rice was infested with small insects. To make it edible, the rice had to be thoroughly boiled. Then, while the water was boiling, the rice was stirred and the dead insects would float to the top and could be skimmed off. During the war, the Japanese army stored munitions near the refugee ghetto. Then later in the war, these storage facilities became targets for the American bombers. To reduce the danger to the refugees who were trapped in the ghetto, American planes would sometimes skywrite what time they planned to bomb to allow people to seek shelter. When bombings were imminent, air raid sirens were sounded. When possible, we would go to a nearby Chinese jail that was located at the edge of the ghetto, and here we sat on the floor along hallways until the all clear sirens were sounded. To this day, I still react to sirens. Shortly after the end of the war, we experienced some new challenges in the ghetto. When the Japanese had originally created this ghetto, they had forced us to move into housing that had previously been occupied by Chinese. After the war, the Chinese that had lived in this housing now demanded their homes be returned. In our case, a Chinese family camped outside our door and was ready to barge in when the door was open. Consequently, when my father returned from an errand, he was unable to open the door because it was blocked by Chinese. 1 second. After the war, they had just find my place here. They had demanded their homes be returned. In our case, a Chinese family camped outside our door and was ready to barge in if the door was opened. Consequently, when my father returned from an errand, he was unable to open the door because it was blocked by Chinese. My mother had to lower supplies to my father from the second story using a basket tied to a rope. My father could not get into our blocked apartment. This situation lasted a couple of days until authorities assured the Chinese that they would get their homes back when the refugees move out. Then the U.S. Army and the highest organization came to our aid, supplying food, blankets, and other necessities. After the U.S. Army got established in Shanghai, many of the troops and equipment were sent home to the U.S. To support their efforts, the U.S. Army recruited local civilians for various duties. My father got a job driving Army personnel carriers and other trucks. And for the first time, at least for a few weeks, my father was earning a living. After the war, I was enrolled in the Horace Kadoorie School that had been established by a wealthy benefactor who had been a long-time resident of Shanghai. This was a Middle Easterner, Kadoorie. Starting in kindergarten, I attended this school during our last 2 years in Shanghai until fall 1947. Each weekday, my father would take me to school where I first learned English while we spoke German at home. During an examination, on one occasion, during an examination by our doctor, my parents were told that my tonsils presented a problem and had to be removed. This procedure would be performed at the nearby immigrant clinic, a primitive hospital. The morning my parents brought me to the clinic, they assured me they would be waiting waiting for me when the procedure was completed. So when I came out of my ether and woke up, I was located near a window in a crib in the men's ward. Nurses were then told me that my parents could not come back into the hospital to see me for a couple of days, which stretched into a week. There had been an outbreak of a contagious disease requiring the staff to quarantine the hospital. That meant I was alone and could only see my parents through the window, waving to me from the courtyard below. The activity around me and separation from my parents was traumatic. Following the war, my parents actively searched for countries where we could resettle. Most countries, including the U.S., responded that their immigration quotas were filled. This search, with the help of highest personnel, continued until sometime in 1947, when the U.S. set aside the immigration quotas. And our family had tried various countries, including Mexico, and all of these were impossible. Our family could, but now in 1947, our family could now apply to immigrate to the U.S. In the weeks that followed, my parents completed the necessary requirements, such as applications, medical exams, x-rays, etc. And then in the fall of 1947, we received notice that our family had been accepted to immigrate to the U.S. Next slide, please. And this is, these are pictures. There's a photo of my family looking across the river. This is taken on the Bund, which is the main drag. This was just before we left. And my sister and I on a park bench. Let's see, 1 second. Next slide, please. For the first time in 10 years, let's see here. We traveled to the U.S. on a Navy warship, the SS Marine Adder, and that's just the travel document and showing the documents we needed to travel on the ship. After a brief stop in Japan, next slide, please, the ship headed to Hawaii, where we spent 1 day sightseeing in Honolulu before our journey continued to San Francisco. And there's the route from Shanghai to Japan, Hawaii, and San Francisco. After very rough seas for several days, our ship finally neared the California coast and approached the Golden Gate Bridge. In anticipation, virtually no one slept that last night, and most passengers gathered on deck to gaze at the magnificent skyline. The ship waited offshore until dawn and then slowly proceeded under the Golden Gate to the docks in the San Francisco Bay. After arriving at our hotel in downtown San Francisco, the first thing we did was take a hot bath. And you should know that this was the first bathtub that my sister and I had ever seen. We didn't have bathtubs in Shanghai in the ghetto in those apartments. We had wash tubs that you sort of washed yourself off, but so this was a novelty for us. And then within days of our arrival, my parents were put to work by the local agencies to look for cities for us to settle in the U.S. Working with advisors in Highest, and I should point out San Francisco was out of the question unless you had ability to find work there. So some people actually stayed, but there was no industry there, so we had to move on. And working with advisors, they suggested that we move to larger metropolitan areas in central U.S. that had industry to provide job opportunities. My parents had heard about St. Louis from friends who had previously settled there. Consequently, after a few weeks in San Francisco, we boarded a train to St. Louis, where we settled. Next slide, please. And here's a couple of shots from St. Louis. the first apartment building that we lived in, and on the left there, that was those were three room, not three bedroom, 3 room apartments, a living room, a bedroom, and a kitchen, and you had to walk through the bedroom to get to the kitchen, and you walk from the living room. So finally, the slide 14, next slide, please. So finally, the larger lessons from this presentation are perseverance, response to changing conditions, and luck. And this is really recaps what we went through, what allowed us to persevere. And finally, next slide, please. And as a postscript, about 60 years after my family had left Shanghai, my wife and I returned to China for business purposes, touring, and to revisit Shanghai and the ghetto. The change of the city was amazing. Only a portion of the ghetto had remained intact, surrounded by high-rise apartments. And I should interject here that this ghetto that you're seeing, like that second photo, the photo in the top right, that's part of the ghetto, and that doesn't exist anymore because that's in the process or has already been torn down to make room for high rises. So basically, the ghetto has disappeared, is what I've learned recently, and is now what remains is the museum across the street from the ghetto. For contrast, shown here are 2 photos of the view looking across. Okay, the next slide, please. For contrast, shown here 2 photos looking across the Bund. And on the left is what it looks like today, and on the right is what you saw when you looked across the Bund just shortly before we left. Finally, the next, please. The remaining evidence of our family's existence in the Shanghai ghetto is the inscription of each of our names on the wall at the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum, located across the street from the remaining part of the ghetto. And in the slide on the right, there's my name, and the one on the left, which is might be less visible, our names are 3 of our names are visible here. Adolf, my sister, my mother, and me. And my sister must have been on another part of the, didn't make this, that photo. Anyway, that concludes my presentation. And I would be happy to respond to questions.
Thank you so much, Ralph. We do have a couple questions. The first, what was it like coming to the U.S.? What's kind of the earliest memory you have of coming here?
Can you talk a little louder? I'm having trouble hearing you.
No problem. What was it like coming to the U.S.? What's your earliest memory of coming here?
My earliest memory was the train ride to St. Louis. I remember I was 7 years old, and I have a pretty good memory of what, the trip. We actually ended up in St. Louis in a hotel briefly, we had a hotel room where all our worldly possessions were packed in this room, and we had to move around them. And I remember that lasted a couple of months until we could find an apartment. So, yeah, I have a pretty vivid memory of, and I was enrolled into school, in a grade school, and my mother dropped me off at school in the morning, and she says the first day she was terrified of dropping me off at school. After all, I spoke English, very little, and she didn't know what kind of reaction I would have. And I was delighted when I came out because they gave me a free pencil. So she says I was just ecstatic about the fact that I now owned a pencil. So anyway, yeah, that was my introduction to school.
Brilliant. One other question we've got is, what brought you to the museum? Why did you, join our museum and start sharing your story?
Well, it was very difficult actually for me to. I did not do this easily because I had a hard time dealing with this story. Especially the fact that we lost so many members of our family. Not only the grandmothers, because the grandfathers had died on their own earlier, but losing my grandmothers as well as many relatives that and hearing all the stories that came out, I had a very difficult time and just wanted to put that in keep that in my past and sort of move on with life. And I then, as I became more aware of the museum, I felt an obligation to get involved.
And we so appreciate that. One last question. What kind of message do you want people to take away after hearing your story?
That that hatred and bigotry and there's no place for that, and that it was allowed to fester. That's what built the fire in Germany. That it festered for many years instead of being squashed early. It was allowed to fester and allowed this leader to build up a head of steam that then went way out of control. And that should never, something like that should never happen again. Okay, so basically that's what I would suggest.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's all the questions I see right now. So I'm going to let you sign off and say goodbye to everybody.
Well, I thank you for tuning in, and I hope you will join us next Wednesday, September 9th at 10 a.m. to hear Holocaust survivor Felix Weil. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times.